Hi friends, thanks for joining me for another Monday Makes video. Today I'm using the stamp set called Cheerful Critters, and I have masked off the sign that the little bear is holding. I'm using Stays On to ink that up because I'm going to be using watercolor or a watercoloring technique. So that is watercolor paper that I'm using, and the initial markers that I started off with, and yet I add a million more: Sahara Sand, Marina Mist, Basic Gray, and Real Red. So I'm going to stamp the image with Stays On, and you can see I've just scribbled that ink on a clear acrylic block. It's like my artist palette, so I can see where the colors are, but you can't really see the Sahara Sand in the video. So I stamped off initially first, and then just because I didn't want a super dark line. And I'll have a disclaimer here. I don't know how to watercolor very well, so this is me learning. I know that in general I want to create some shadows like I would normally do with my alcohol markers, have some light and dark parts to it, create some roundness. So I am using sort of a heavier line on one side or heavier ink on one side, and sort of keeping them middle on the lighter side. And this is me kind of experimenting with my ink markers as watercolor markers. So thought you would like to try something like this as well, but there's a couple of really cool techniques that I'll show you a little bit later on in the video as well. I think then I've added, oh boy, I'm not sure, there was a darker brown, maybe baked brown sugar. I guess this is more about the technique, not necessarily about the colors that I'm using. Okay, so what I know about watercolor is you have to let, if you're doing one part of the image, you need to let that dry before you go on to a second part of the image, or the colors can bleed together. Also, you need to use a ink for your base image that is not going to wash away. So that's the reason why I chose the Stays On. I'm using an aqua pen here, which has water already to it, but when I do the background, you'll see that I use just a regular paintbrush. And I do go over, once the image is dry, I do go over it 2 times just to get the depth. So I'm using chalk lines because I didn't want him just standing in the middle of the road. And if you're really quick with the classic ink pads, you can use embossing powder, clear embossing powder over top of them. I don't know if many people knew that, but you can. And I'll show you the result. This will give you a nice close-up of embossing. So, see, look, it actually does hold on to the embossing powder. So that's really cool. So you don't necessarily need any more embossing powders than you have inks. So it's a really good way of stretching your stamps, or sorry, stretching your inks, I guess. All right, so I've come in with, oh gosh, a whole bunch of blues, and I'm doing the background. So I started off using a really fine tipped brush, and I quite like that, but I needed to cover a larger area, so I'm using a little bit of a larger brush. And in some areas I am putting ink on the brush and putting it down, and some areas I'm wetting first and then adding the ink. And I saw this tutorial on a lady's blog called W+9, and she does amazing watercolor. So if you're looking for watercolor techniques, that's the girl to follow. So she did something similar. Hers was very different. She had sort of like a storybook look to her image and background. So this is just me kind of trying to get a handle on it, basically. And I thought that it'd be interesting to share this, especially if, you know, you're afraid to try watercoloring, because it's so loosey-goosey. And sometimes it's a little daunting. It's daunting for me. So I just say, go give it a go. So I did kind of want to make a sky background. So I wanted it to sort of look like clouds. So I did kind of want those harsh lines where the paper or the ink sort of stops and dries and makes a harder line. And when you go over it a couple or 3 times, it never looks great. It's like hair. Whenever you're doing an updo for a bride, it never looks finished until it's finished. So don't give up. If it looks like poo-poo at the beginning, it's not necessarily going to look that way in the end. So don't give up. And the nice thing, the watercolor paper can hold a lot of ink. And unfortunately, this isn't Stampin' Up brand. I think this is Canston. One of my clients for Christmas bought me a whole pad of this beautiful water paper, 140 pounds, amazing. So I just cut it up into card base size, or part of it. And yeah, I'm using it today. And you'll notice that I didn't put it on a board. And I should have, because it was actually quite difficult to stamp with. So I'm using, what is it, the Big News stamp set, and I wanted this great big congrats on there because I don't have that many congratulation cards. And I know there's people, you know, getting job promotions, and we just need to have a few on hand. So I'm using the Versamark ink, and you can see now that I've actually taped the page down. So that's nice, and I'm getting a nice clear impression of that ink because it is a little warbly. This is the reason why I like putting my my paper on a board. And then I'm using half of the gold embossing powder from Stampin' Up, and then I'm going to use silver on the other half of the greeting. And I do like those little coffee filters because I can just quickly put them aside. I can do a couple different colors and funnel them back into the buckets. So, and I always like looking at how the embossing goes. It's like magic. It's so neat. The heating to set it, just a really cool effect. It's always fun. And you can see now that that background is much different than I started with. So because this is a watercolor paper, I wanted to use the Fast Fuse, which is a really strong adhesive. It's made by Tombow, and it's going to really stick. So if you liked any of the products that I used, you can head on to my blog and I'll give you a link. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next Monday. Bye.